Oh, that's very interesting. I've never actually thought about it in that way. That's very, very interesting. Yeah, but it's very interesting that, this market mechanism that we speak of, which, as Adam Smith says, has an invisible hand that's working constantly, has produced the kind of societies that it has produced. We'll talk a bit about a TED Talk that you gave, which I found extremely insightful when I was thinking about how I'd like this conversation to go, because not all human history was about prosperity. We are, in a sense, one of the lucky ones in human history to have, been brought up in societies that actually can produce wealth that is able to sustain the entire populations, so to speak. I mean, we can talk a bit about the distribution of wealth. I think that's a separate topic, but I think just the ability to create that wealth is something, when you look through the historical lens and when you look back into antiquity, is something that was unheard of. And it's Adam Smith again who's perhaps the chief pioneer of this idea. And as Steven Pinker points out in Enlightenment Now, has been vindicated. Like, there are a few historical or economic prophecies that have been vindicated, as that of Adam Smith's about, the wealth of nations. And he has a very interesting statistic that I would just like us to ponder over in Enlightenment Now. This is Steven Pinker now. He says that 200 years ago, 90% of the population lived below the poverty line, and only 10% lived above it. And of course, you can understand, because back then there was a feudal system in place where only the lords accumulated anything approximating wealth, and everybody else, was subjugated. But fast forward 200 years, and that situation has completely reversed, with now 90% of the population living above the poverty line and only 10% living below it. Now, of course, that 10% is still a staggering number, and something, of course, must be done about it. But we are mistaken if we are thinking that in order to get rid of that poverty that still exists in that bottom 10%, that we need to move away from the principles that lifted so many people out of abject poverty. So I just really like to get your opinion on that.
Pinker absolutely nailed it. And you can see it more extremely. You said very carefully, that not all of human history was one of prosperity. You don't have to be so careful. None of it, until the Industrial Revolution, was about shared prosperity. We have a very long history of shared poverty and wealth and prosperity for only a tiny minority of society. And it's not just in feudalism, it's in all societies that preceded feudalism as well.
Right.
So it is an undifferentiated history of poverty. And then in the Industrial Revolution, we discover suddenly a mechanism, a social mechanism, and it's not a discovery which is made in the head of a person. Smith lays bare a mechanism by which we can jointly do it, even though none of us intend to do it. And that's the extraordinary part of this discovery. Hayek, of course, is the most powerful modern exponent of that view, that this is an unintended outcome of the market society. So it's not as if this is the purpose of the market to make us wealthier, but the consequence of us being able to collaborate in this way creates the circumstances in which we've become tremendously more wealthy. Now, let me spend a minute to give you an idea of just how astonishing this change is. For all of human history since the agricultural revolution, so now I'm talking about 12,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago, so from the beginning of the agricultural revolution to the Bronze Age, if I said, well, in fact, our archaeology reveals that the average person at that point lived just about at the level of subsistence. So in your head, picture a supermarket trolley, and imagine that supermarket trolley contains everything you need to subsist in a year.
Sure.
So the first great technological advance in history starts at the Bronze Age. It's not so much about bronze, it's about writing. Writing allows us, by the way, to collaborate across vast distances and trade for the first time across considerable distances. And we learn to write for accounting before we learn to write poetry.
Yeah, that's a very peculiar archaeological finding.
But it is the case that we learned this tremendously powerful instrument of collaboration called writing. Just as speech was the first great step, and that happens much further, more like 80,000 years ago. But 5,000 years ago, writing, it raises the size of your trolley by 40%. So if it was a meter high at the start, it's now 1.4 meters high. And the trolley does not rise for the next 3,000 years.
Sure.
So then we come to the common era. The trolley is still 1.4 meters high. We roll it forward a bit for another 1,000 years, it's still 1.4 meters. For the average person in the world, it's still 1.4 meters high. Now in the year 1100 about, it starts to grow quite slowly, and by about the 17th century, it is a 2-meter high trolley. In the 18th century, we enter the Industrial Revolution in some parts of the world. Now the size of that basket of goods that you have start to rise very sharply. And by the time we reach the year 2000, it is a 23-story high.
Jeez.
So it is a qualitative change. It's not just that we have more stuff. It's that we have a command over resources of unimaginably greater size than we ever thought society could yield. Nobody could have, so it's not a linear process. Nobody could have predicted that if we arrange society in this way, of which Smith was the first great exponent, that between Smith's time and ours, the command of goods would rise 23-fold. Now, if you start more poorly, we were starting in Scotland, not the poorest society in the world in the 1770s. If you start in Korea post-war, then the rise between Korea post-war and Korea today is 40-fold. Not doubling, tripling, quadrupling, 40-fold rise in prosperity in a country like Korea in the post-war era. Yeah. So that is the power. So you're absolutely right. And Pinker is right. And it's a beautiful summary of another author who said, those of us who have lived through the last 50 years have lived through the best 50 years in the history of humankind. And that really is almost certainly uncontroversially true. Yeah. Which doesn't mean to say we haven't got many problems.
Right.
Authors like Hayek and Friedman and Smith in his time all emphasized the many things that we still need to fix in society. But that doesn't take away from the fact that what we have lived through is undoubtedly the greatest rise for the greatest number of people that we have ever experienced.
I think there's no question about it. I mean, I think just with sticking with Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, which, I mean, to this day remains one of the best books I've ever read. He makes a very, very strong defense of Enlightenment principles. And he has graph after graph just showing the improvement that we've made over a long period of time. Because, I mean, it's very easy to look at the news today and think that, we've been declining since way back when. But I think it's a peculiar thing about the news. The news is about reporting what happens and not what doesn't happen. So you don't see a news anchor going to a place that was once in war that is now peaceful and saying, there's no war going on here anymore. So I mean, that kind of stuff does not sell in the news. And if you are one that imbibes the news quite frequently, then you will have a distorted picture of reality and thinking that we are far worse than we actually are, and not realize that actually the business of news is about telling us what happens and not what doesn't happen. And I think Steven Pinker shows quite powerfully over the long run just how staggering the improvements are. I mean, it's undoubtable that this is the best period ever in human history to be a human being.
I don't think there's serious doubt about that. And you're right, Pinker shows it extremely convincingly. And if you disagree with that, what you reveal is simply an ideological redefinition of the question.
Right.
Because if we talk about the prosperity and if we respect the lives of everybody on the planet, and we say it matters hugely that somebody in China emerges from crippling poverty into a state that is still poor but no longer cripplingly poor, if we regard that as enormously important as we should, then there really can't be any doubt that the hundreds of millions of people, literally hundreds of millions that have emerged from poverty in the last 20 years, following on from hundreds of millions at the end of the previous century too, this is the greatest single social event of our era, and it's highly beneficial.
Yeah, and that of course is not to say that there aren't societies that haven't regressed. We do have societies today that aren't doing very well. I mean, the Venezuelas, the North Koreas, the Chinas in before the